started. It's good to see you guys this morning. Good to see you. So this is second week of Lent. How many of you gave up some for Lent? How many of you are like second guessing and wishing you would have given up something else for Lent? Then, yeah, it happens. Just be graceful with yourself. During sabbatical, me and Kristen spent a few days in Prague. We had never been there. We splurged on a tour guide, a woman, she's about 10 years older than us, who spent the day with us, walking us around the city, teaching us their history, and what it was like to grow up behind the Iron Curtain. And she knew I was a musician, and so she mentioned this band that played a big role in the Czech liberation from the Soviets. And so when I got home, I started researching these guys, and I want to share just a bit of their story. If you were plopped down in Prague in the early 1960s, what you would see is like a once vibrant cultural center, now gray and heavily surveilled with Soviet censorship that just stifled free expression and creativity, and secret police who monitored all dissent. And then around 1966, a new leader came on board and began relaxing some of the Stalinist policies in Prague. And these posters started to appear for something called Big Beat. It's what they called rock and roll in that place, time and place. And then lectures and poetry readings would pop up in coffee houses and cafes as Prague kind of exploded into what would later be called the Prague Spring. It was this brief period of political openness, Western engagement, and artistic freedoms. This time when artists and filmmakers and poets, musicians, playwrights came out from behind the Iron Curtain and began to create and inspire. And it lasted about 7 months until the Warsaw Pact nations invaded with tanks and armies and just put an end to it. They arrested dissident leaders, they halted reforms, they imposed martial law and reinstated censorship and all that stuff, monitoring, and nearly overnight, the Prague Spring, all that art and culture and creativity and engagement, it was forced underground. And any artist in Prague became a dissident just by virtue of existing as an artist. And about that same time, 1968, a local band called the Plastic People of the Universe played their very first gig. Anybody heard of Plastic People? It would kind of make me worry if you had. It's very trippy, psychedelic 60s stuff is wild. I have tried to like them so hard and I just can't, but the story is amazing. Their music was wild and experimental and very raw. Their gigs were like Andy Warhol's Happenings. Remember that at the factory in New York City? This trippy 60s psychedelic, kind of almost like performance art. And their manager and creative director was this dissident writer who had been banned from publishing. So he was like, I'll just steer this band instead. Their first show is legendary. They came out dressed in long gowns with big letters sewn to the hem of their gowns that say UFO, with a huge wooden flying saucer hanging from the ceiling, and these giant balloons of transparent plastic stretched from floor to ceiling while open fires burned indoors in these giant ashtrays. And the band also knew they weren't very good at the time. But their manager explained it isn't about the quality of their music, but the fact that they were playing at all that was incredible. And they sang in English, the language of freedom, they thought, covering American bands like Velvet Underground. But after the crackdown, things changed. The regime decided that every musician had to have a license in order to play in public. And so you had to come and audition in front of a jury, provide all your lyrics, play a couple songs, and then they would decide. Needless to say, the Plastic People of the Universe did not get a permit to play. And so they had to get creative. So what they did is they started out advertising. They would charge for people to come hear an art lecture. And the art lecture would last about 5 minutes, and they were like, how about if we give you a demonstration, which would last like 2 hours, right? This is how they did it. And they tried this several times. It worked for a while, but then the government shut them down. And so they had to try something else. They discovered that it was not yet illegal to perform any music at weddings. And so every wedding in kind of the underground music scene that happened became this huge event where the Plastics would come and play. And members of the group itself got legally married just so that they could play at the wedding. And one divorced couple got remarried just so they could have the Plastics come be their wedding band. And eventually the government got wise and shut this down too. And so they had to start playing outside of the city, like in the country, in barns and farm buildings. They would go set up and then they'd share the location at the very last minute. And people would pile in cars and walk for miles, carpool out to the farm. They'd play the show and then disappear as fast as they could, hopefully before the secret police showed up. But pretty soon, informants had kind of infiltrated their fan base, and it got harder to pull off. But they went on like this for a while, like 5 years. And during that time, a guy named Vladislav Bravenek joined the band. He was a former theology student and saxophone player. He was deeply shaped by the teachings of Christ. And that's him playing sax right there. He began writing all their songs, wrote the songs for their first album. It was called Egon Bondi's Happy Hearts Club Band, B-A-N-N-E-D. Egon, yes, good. Egon Bondy was the pen name of a dissident writer who couldn't publish. And so they set his lyrics to music so he would be published. And it wasn't actually explicitly political material. It was more about just being part of this joyful community. Bravenek later said, our identity as a band was to do with poetry, not politics. The politicians made us political by being offended by what we did and the music we played. Although they did poke quite a lot of fun at the Soviet regime, who just tried in vain to silence the Czech young people, and it didn't work. But as the band's popularity grew, very often they wound up in jail alongside their fans after a show. And soon other bands started popping up. And in 1976, they planned a big music festival way far south in this rural town called České Budějovice. And border guards showed up at this and started just beating the crowds viciously, driving them like cattle onto trains headed back to Prague. It was a really bloody and brutal day. Hundreds of their fans were injured. And the band began to have doubts. But it was about that time that Bravenek began interacting with some other dissidents working secretly in Prague, academics and writers and philosophers who had been fired from their jobs by the Soviet regime were giving secret lectures and circulating banned literature. One playwright, a very famous Czech playwright named Václav Havel, was the leader of this dissident group of writers, and he became very important for the band. And Havel was also deeply influenced by Christian thought. He used Christian themes in many of his writings. He even organized public readings of scripture just as an act of rebellion or resistance. And one night, Bravenek, or no, it wasn't Bravenek, it was actually their manager, the creative director, met up with Havel at a pub, and they hatched a plan for him to show up at their next concert and speak to the crowd. But one of the bartenders was an informant, and he heard them. And the next day, the entire band was arrested. And the indictment, it's funny, it lists a bunch of things, including disturbing the peace and anti-socialist impact, but one of the charges was clericalism, the use of explicitly Christian themes in their writing. On the day of the trial for the band, these musicians, Václav Havel, that playwright, he showed up at the courthouse with the entire dissident intellectual community. And of course, the underground music scene, they all came out as well. It was a massive crowd, just a huge crowd. And it was really the first time those two pockets of the resistance had ever come together. So the government had like inadvertently united the dissident community through this trial. And it scared them. They let most of the musicians go. But these two groups then began talking together and making plans. Bravenek and 3 other members of the band ended up going to jail, but instead of the sentence handed down was like 10 or 15 years, they only spent like 18 months in jail. But the overall result of this day was this famous manifesto called Charter 77 that criticized the government for refusing to implement the freedoms they agreed to under the Helsinki Accords. And the government response, of course, was a brutal crackdown that really only fueled the resistance. And over the next 12 years, musicians and dissidents in Prague became more and more vocal, and eventually they began to gather every night publicly in Wenceslas Square. A few thousand at first, then 10,000, 20, then hundreds of thousands gathered night after night after night, demanding freedom and demanding change. Our tour guide told a story. She was a teenager then. She would go every night she could. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the entire Czech cabinet resigned, and within a month, Václav Havel, that playwright that was their friend, was elected president. And this became what is known around the world as the Velvet Revolution that ended communist rule in Czechoslovakia. And as I was reading the Gospel of Luke this week and tracing the movements of Jesus and listening to the kind of things he would say, I kept thinking of this story of the plastic people of the universe. These poets and storytellers who helped liberate the Czech people, just mostly by poking fun at the politicians and just refusing to be sad, just refusing to be downcast. And they formed this little community of joyful rebellion that was kind of too alive to be controlled. And I think I thought about this because Jesus wasn't a politician either. He was much more of an artist, a storyteller, a prophet who helped people imagine a whole new way to be human. And he was branded a dissident by an oppressive regime. Although things did not go as well for his people. In the years following his death, Jewish factions vied for power. Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes fought each other and Rome. The Zealots did everything they could do, from vandalism to assassination, to provoke a war with Rome. And the violence escalated until things erupted in AD 66, when the Jews became embroiled in a terrible war with Rome, culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem and the leveling of the temple and the death of more than a million Jews. And the era known as the diaspora began. And the Jewish people were scattered all over the Mediterranean, north to like modern day Turkey and Ukraine, Eastern Europe, much of Eastern Europe. And in this mix was this small little band of Jewish people known as the Christians. They were led in Jerusalem by Peter, James, and John, and then the diaspora by Paul, who was starting little Christian communities. And one of his companions was this guy named Luke. Traveled with Paul and acted as a physician and teacher. And as Roman persecution escalated, the suffering did as well. And many leaders of the church were rounded up and tortured and killed. In fact, by AD 70, when the war culminated, only John was left from the original 12. Christians were scattered along with the Jews, living as dissidents under an oppressive regime. And the response of these little Christian communities, like scattered all over the diaspora, is interesting. It wasn't an armed rebellion or even a political movement. Instead, they began a period of incredible creativity. They wrote songs and hymns, liturgies and prayers, innovating new forms of worship and modes of discipleship. Luke, this physician and disciple of Paul, he was part of this creative work. Luke had a friend named Theophilus. We actually have no idea who Theophilus was. We just know that Luke began writing him an account of the life of Christ in the early church, which he addressed to his friend Theophilus, saying, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." In the chaos following the death of Christ and the catastrophic war with Rome, Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. They were probably originally one work in 2 volumes, which together make up nearly a quarter of the New Testament, more than any other writer, including Paul. And along with the other Gospels and the writings of Peter, James, John, and Paul, Luke's writings really helped to galvanize that early church into this dynamic community of dissidents that faced down empires and changed the course of human history. And they did this not by might, not by power, but by this spirit-led reimagination of what it meant to be human in light of what they had encountered in Christ. And it's kind of wild. In the first 2 centuries after Christ's death, there was this burst of creativity. That was their response to life under an oppressive regime. And their creativity became this powerful catalyst for the spread of Christianity and this new vision for humanity to the rest of the world. Our text that we heard earlier comes from Luke 13. It says, at that time, some of the Pharisees came to Jesus and said to him, leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you. And his reply to them is, go tell that fox, I will keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the 3rd day, I will reach my goal. It's a defiant tone, especially given what we know about Herod. You know, the first Herod was Herod the Great. He was a vassal king under Caesar who ruled Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and all those surrounding areas. He was very cruel and violent, universally despised. He's very hard on the Jewish people, and even with his own family. In fact, he eventually died with no clear line of succession because he didn't trust any of his sons. And so his 3 sons vied for the throne. There was Herod Archelaus, Herod Philip, and Herod Antipas. And after their father's death, all 3 of them traveled to Rome to sort things out with Caesar. And these 3 were so hated back in especially Jerusalem and Judea, but all around, that a delegation of 50 Pharisees traveled to Rome to plead with Caesar not to put these guys in power. But he ignored them, split the region into 4 kingdoms, gave Archelaus 2 of them. He got Judea and Jerusalem in the south. He gave Philip the east and the Decapolis, the 10 cities, and gave Antipas Galilee, up where Jesus grew up. And he called them tetrarchs, quarter kings, who ruled these 4 regions. Archelaus, after the insult in Rome with the Pharisees, he got back to Jerusalem right at the time of Passover, picked a fight with the Jews, and slaughtered 3,000 of them inside the temple. He terrorized the Jews in Judea. And if you remember, this is the whole reason in Mary and Joseph, in the birth story in Luke, that Mary and Joseph move up to Galilee instead of settling in Judea with Joseph's whole family. The reason was Archelaus was reigning in Judea, and he was warned in a dream to move up north. When the 50 Pharisees finally got home, Archelaus asked to meet with them to make peace, but instead had them killed while the other nobles watched. Just kind of set the tone for his rule. And many years later, when Luke wrote his account to Theophilus, he included this story that Jesus used to tell. A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, we don't want this man to be our king. He was made king, however, and returned home. And then when the parable ends, they have the king saying, those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me. So the people listening to Jesus, they had a pretty good idea what he was talking about. It's a subversive story about Archelaus and his reign of terror. He kept doing this kind of stuff. Archelaus did not last long. I think it was less than a year. He was replaced by Coponius and then Pontius Pilate. Up in Galilee, where Jesus lived, the ruler was Herod Antipas. Antipas had married the daughter of one of his enemies across the border, King Herods, and it was just a political marriage to keep the peace across a border until Herod Antipas fell in love with his brother, Herod Philip. He fell in love with his brother's wife, a woman named Herodias. It was a huge scandal. And Antipas and Herodias, they wanted to get married, but they were both already married. He was married to King Aretas' daughter. She was married to his brother, Herod Philip. By the way, she was also the daughter of one of Herod Antipas' other brothers, which meant that if Antipas married Herodias, his brother's wife, she would be his wife, his niece, and his sister-in-law. Not making this up. If they had children, Herodias would be their mother, their aunt, and their cousin. Yeah. Insert rural Missouri jokes here, right? So Herodias agreed. She's going to leave Philip and marry Antipas on one condition. He had to divorce the daughter of King Aretas, which he did. Of course, she ran home to daddy, and daddy came knocking with an army of 20,000 soldiers. And Antipas, not the sharpest tool in the shed, went into battle with an army of 10,000 facing an army of 20,000 and was humiliated. And when Luke wrote his account to Theophilus, he included this parable Jesus used to tell. Suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. I mean, everybody knew exactly what he's talking about. I can just imagine them laughing and Jesus going, "What? It's just a little story I like to tell about a king." You know? Antipas, he wanted so bad to be great like his father. His father had rebuilt the temple. He was a big builder. And so Antipas began constructing the city of Tiberias. This is probably Jesus maybe 25 at this point. It's supposed to be this cosmopolitan city on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. But the site that he chose was right on top of a Jewish burial ground. And he was warned about this and didn't listen. He just wanted to build it there. And so the local Jewish laborers refused to work there. He had to bring in outside labor, which was super expensive. And so he very quickly went broke and had to just halt the project and try to raise some money. City sat there unfinished for long periods of time. And it was right around that time, just a few years later, that Jesus told this parable, also in Luke. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Of course, he's poking fun at Antipas, which is the kind of thing that will get you branded a dissident, which is exactly what happened. When his cousin John had criticized Herod Antipas and his marriage to Herodias, Herod had John arrested and jailed. That's what happened to dissidents. But he didn't kill him because John was very popular with the people and Antipas was kind of afraid of him. And so Herodias, his new bride and sister-in-law, and whatever cousin, had her daughter, Salome, dance for Antipas. And he was so pleased that he, in his drunkenness, offered her one wish, and her mom put her up to it. She said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist on the platter." Just plainly manipulated by his own wife. He was one of those kings that was really into luxury and fine clothes and the latest trends and palaces, and was kind of seen by the people as foolish and weak. Back then, kings would reinforce their rule by putting their own image on money, just to say, like, remember, I'm the source of all of this stuff. But he ruled a Jewish region, and graven images were offensive. So he used on the coins the image of a reed on the money. This is the money Jesus would have used. And the reed became a symbol of Herod Antipas's rule. And so when the crowds came to hear Jesus teach, they asked, "Aren't you and your cousin John, are you afraid of this Antipas guy?" And Jesus said, "What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind?" Everyone knew who he was talking about, right? A man dressed in fine clothes. Is that what you want to see? No, those who wear expensive clothes and indulge in luxury are in palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet. Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. You start to see the pattern here of what Jesus is doing, just this kind of prophetic storytelling, this subversive kind of teaching. He spoke in riddles and codes. Mostly, they're mostly lost on us today unless we really read the histories. But back then, they knew exactly what he was talking about. And they knew Jesus didn't fight power with power, but with laughter and stories. If you track his movement, he really tried to avoid Antipas. He never went into one of the towns where he had a palace. And anytime things heated up, he'd go up north to Philip's territory. He just avoided a direct confrontation. And wherever he went, he's just telling stories and parables, just critiquing and lampooning from afar. Never raised an army to fight. Never fought him head on. He just subverted his rule by telling stories about his foolishness. And then by embodying a new kind of community, a different kind of kingdom, a better way to live. Luke told Theophilus about this. He said, Jesus traveled from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, and Susanna, and many others. These women were helping support them out of their own means. So Luke includes these details about these women who played a huge role in Jesus' ministry, which itself was very subversive. They were among his closest followers. They were bankrolling, really, his ministry, including Joanna, whose husband is named Chuza, who is second in charge in Herod Antipas's household. So basically, Herod Antipas was bankrolling Jesus' ministry from his own treasury. And he had no idea. It's incredibly subversive stuff. And Jesus just taught with such humor in the midst of what had to be a very confusing time for his people. He never cowered to the Herods. They were just foxes, right? Reeds, swayed by the wind. A bunch of posers in fine clothes. But when he opposed them, it wasn't with strength. It was with these subversive stories and then this way of organizing and opposing brutality with gentleness in their community, violence with peacemaking, vengeance with reconciliation, punishment with grace, fear with humor, and hatred with love. His courage and faith seemed to rub off on his people. And eventually Antipas got interested in him, started asking about him and sending his soldiers out to find him. But Jesus just moved around, stayed one step ahead of him. And when the Pharisees came to warn him, leave this place, he's coming after you, Luke said that Jesus responded saying, go tell that fox, I will keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will reach my goal. And so you sense here a change has come. Jesus is preparing for a confrontation with the powers. And it's funny, in ancient writings, the fox was often contrasted with the lion. The lion was brave. That was the one that killed the prey. And when the lion had eaten its fill, the foxes would sneak in and clean things up after the leftovers. Foxes were pretenders, like lion wannabes. Foxes were scavengers and opportunists. So when Jesus says, go tell that fox, this is not a compliment. He's calling Herod a scavenger, an opportunist who's just kind of living off his daddy's fortune. His kingdom was a sham. You can just hear the defiance in his voice. Antipas is the fox. His father in heaven is the lion. And Jesus was his father's herald, proclaiming good news to the poor and release to the captive and sight to the blind in the year of Jubilee when everyone will have enough. And he said, so I'm going to keep going this time. On the first day, the second day, and on the third day, I will reach my goal. So he's kind of signaling he knew this was going to lead to his death. And then he was trusting inexplicably this hope he had in resurrection, the ultimate victory, turning death into life. And so he, in essence, Jesus would go to Jerusalem for the head-on collision so that his people wouldn't have to. Their task was different. And he had shown him what it was. You can't oppose brutality with more brutality. You have to oppose it with creativity and humor. You have to embody a genuine alternative. You have to kind of come so alive that the kingdoms of the world look foolish and silly in comparison to your community until they just collapse under their own weight. This was the message. But his people would not listen, which is why Luke ends his this passage with the image of the barnyard fire. If you remember, the hen trying to gather her chicks under her wings, where the hen would die, but the chicks would live. This is what he was doing. Facing the powers for them so that they could live. But his people had no imagination for it. All they could think about was war. The Jewish people just set their face toward war. And so in 70 AD, Jerusalem was sacked, the temple was destroyed, and Luke, he wasn't one of the 12. Luke watched it happen. And then he wrote these stories into his gospel. And as we think about Jesus' life and ministry and the times in which we're living right now, I think he's given us a powerful imagination for how to respond to leaders in our own time. Not so much to fight them head to head, but to subvert them through creativity and art and humor and storytelling. And ultimately through the formation of a new community that embodies just a much better way of being in the world, one where everyone has a place and can find a way to be at peace. Because we live in a time of chaos and division, and I mean, our politics and our culture are just so divided. And I have no idea where it's going. But I think a lot about the question, like, what should be our faithful response as Christians? And this week, I just think I was seeing it in the plastic people of the universe and in the prophetic preaching and storytelling of Jesus. It's not to arm for war or struggle for power and control. I think the problems we face require a much more creative response. It's much more about living in solidarity with the excluded and embodying a rich life that's full of joy, and laughter, a richness, a goodness, a depth of living where everyone gets to join in. This week I ran across something Stanley Hauerwas said that I loved. It was so Hauerwas. It insulted me, and that's how I knew I liked it. That Hauerwas said, Christians should stop bemoaning their loss of cultural and political power and instead welcome their status as outsiders and embrace the radical alternative Jesus has had in mind for them all along. I think he's right. Our task is to organize a radical alternative. A common life filled with stories and humor and solidarity with outcasts, filled with art, music and poetry, and dreams about a better future, filled with laughter. It's so liberating to laugh, A free people laugh a lot. Another one of my guys I love, Slavoj Žižek, he wrote, the greatest danger for a totalitarian regime, he grew up behind the Iron Curtain as well, the greatest danger for a totalitarian regime is not violent revolution, but a joke that makes the system ridiculous. That's it. Whatever else is happening in the world right now, we've got to hang on to our sense of humor. The joy of being alive is part of our birthright as Christians. It's powerful. And it will have an impact on our world. I don't know exactly what our common life should look like, but I do trust this community. And I think we'll find a way to respond faithfully. And this is, after all, what the wilderness is for. It's for figuring out how to go on when you really don't know where you are at the time. It's the time to build a new imagination for how to be faithful. And I don't know what it needs to be. I really honestly don't. But I really trust this community that will find a way. and that we'll be able to live and flourish and laugh and love and create something beautiful and compelling in this next season of our common life. And so this is what I pray for. Let's pray. Oh God, we do ask that you would give us an imagination for how to live in the world as your hopeful people. Help us to really see, give us eyes to see what's truly happening, and give us time to grieve the pain of it all, but then give us a hope for the future. Give us creativity and help us to just engage our imagination and our hands. Do stuff that's crazy and trippy and weird. Something only free people do in this world where everybody seems to be so trapped in such bondage. Amen. If you would